Everybody, good morning. It is absolutely my privilege to welcome you all to the inaugural talk of the Peter Hassrick Public Programs Series, produced by the Whitney Western Art Museum. Today is the first of an exciting lineup of events scheduled through 2022 and well beyond. So if you love Western American art, and I imagine you're here because you do and because you love Peter, if you love Western American art, you'll surely find many topics of interest among the diverse offerings that we're busily dreaming up, with you all in mind, absolutely. And to that end, if you want to hear about something specifically, please let me know. Please reach out via email, via phone. We want to make sure that we are discussing topics of interest to you. So for 2 years now, we've carefully watched and weighed health and safety concerns and elected to postpone the launch of this series. It was over 2 years ago, and in fact it will be 3 this October, that we lost our dear friend Peter H. Hassrick, this series' namesake. I see many familiar faces here in the crowd today, many of Peter's friends, some of his family members, and beyond this auditorium, of course, we know that there are crowds more of folks who knew and admired him. Peter was called a titan of his field. It would be easy enough for me to invoke a phrase like, "What hasn't been said about Peter?" or "Peter's a man who needed no introduction." But I must and will dwell on such an introduction. He was one of Western American art's greatest champions. No one worked more passionately to bring international attention to the field. And he shared his passion and vast knowledge as an author, a speaker, a teacher, and encouraged others' scholarship through collaboration and mentorship. Over the course of his career, Peter advocated for the valuable role that education plays in museums. And so what better way, we thought, to honor Peter's monumental contributions to this field, to raising awareness and appreciation for Western American art, than by establishing the Peter Hassrick Public Programs Fund. More than 90 generous donors, many of whom are sitting here today, contributed to this fund, allowing the Whitney Western Art Museum to plan for a robust suite of public programs into the future. The fund perpetuates Peter's passion for innovative and engaging public programming and expands upon his efforts to connect people from around the world to stories of the American West and its compelling art history. I, Karen McWhorter, am the curator of the Whitney Western Art Museum for a couple more months, and presently the Collier Reed Director of Curatorial Education and Museum Services here. I had the distinct pleasure of working with Peter for more than a decade, from the beginning of my professional career, which he helped launch, back in Denver and then here in Cody. I wouldn't be where I am today without him. There's no question about that, and many others would say the same. As a Hassrick mentee, coordinating this first season of the Peter Hassrick Public Program Series, it's going to remain one of the most important and impactful moments of my career. We're going to bring you leading thinkers and creators here to Cody for the benefit of our community and our visitors. We'll share programs online to reach an audience worldwide, and you can expect compelling content delivered in a variety of formats. We're keeping your interests and everyone's ages and engagement styles in mind. We'll host symposia and single speaker events. We may add workshops and classes. With Peter's legacy as our guide, we'll focus on sharing cutting-edge research, fostering new perspectives, and exploring the creative processes behind Western American art and also its cultural connections. The format of today's program is going to differ a little bit slightly from future programs. Today we have the honor of being joined by Professor Carol Clark remotely. I'll turn over the mic to Carol in just a moment for a few opening remarks, and then we'll tune in to a pre-recorded talk and then resume our conversation here in person via Zoom. But I would like to provide a brief introduction to our esteemed guest. Carol Clark is the William McCall Vickery 1957 Professor of the History of Art and American Studies Emerita at Amherst College. She earned a BA in history and a master's in art history from the University of Michigan and a PhD in art history from Case Western Reserve University. Before beginning at Amherst in 1987, she was a fellow, then professor at Williams College, and served as curator of paintings at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. And I just want to shout out to a group from the Amon Carter here with us today. So Peter's, Carol's, and some of the staff members here's stories overlap in a beautiful and serendipitous way. Carol's most recent book is the award-winning Charles Deas in 1840s America, published in conjunction with an exhibition she coordinated for the Denver Art Museum. Carol, I would love for you to make a couple introductory remarks, then we'll turn on your presentation and then bring you back online.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Can you hear me, I hope?
We can, Carol. We're going to turn you down just a little bit, though. Is that okay?
Okay.
Jeff, is that you or me? Let me see. Thanks for your patience, everybody. All right, Carol, give it a try now.
Okay, thank you. I will speak more quietly, perhaps. Thank you very much, Karen, for those generous remarks. It is a real honor for me to inaugurate the Peter Hassrick Public Program Series and to begin my talk with thoughts about Peter, whom I must admit I met over almost 50 years ago. I'm sorry that this has to be over Zoom. Zoom, a noun, a verb, an adjective, an adverb, that has been both bane and boon to our lives these past couple of years. I hope today, for all of us, it's more of the latter. And I hope too, for all of you gathered at its gateway, that Yellowstone reopens soon, and that those who live nearby recover from the flooding. As Karen mentioned, I welcome your questions at the end of my talk about a topic dear to all of us, Western American art.
Greetings. I'm delighted to be here with you, virtually of course, because here for me is Newton, Massachusetts, to talk about Peter Hassrick's legacy, to think through with you the category Western American art, and in the process to introduce you to a newly discovered painting by Charles Deas. But first, a hearty thanks to the Buffalo Bill staff, especially to Karen McWhorter, for making possible my virtual visit. I look forward to returning to Cody one day very soon. I am preaching to the choir, I know that. Each one of you has a story that exemplifies Peter's thoughtfulness, his kindness, or his high standards. You may remember a decision he made as director with which you agreed and applauded, or you may remember one with which you were less comfortable or perhaps disagreed, but you knew that in each case he had in mind the best interests of the Buffalo Bill. This pandemic year plus has focused attention on the many challenges facing today's museum directors. I think Peter would have agreed and reminded us that there were many challenges in the past too, such as a single museum with diverse collections, each with its particular needs and goals, such as yours, sometimes in conflict, I would imagine. Yet Peter effectively led them all as a single entity for the community and the many visitors from across the nation and the world who made their way to Cody. He was an administrator and a scholar, a combination increasingly rare these days. Peter had high standards of his colleagues. He pushed us all. Driven is a word I would use to describe him. Yet that drive was softened by a wicked sense of humor and life priorities balanced toward Buzzy and their family. His commitment to the West was unwavering, and he wanted to share it with audiences far and wide. One or two examples of this was his co-organizing a Remington show that went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1989, and in 2013, participating as a co-organizer in a show of Western American bronzes that opened there. The lead review of each show in the New York Times was harsh. Words like despicable for Remington and kitsch for Western-themed sculpture. But Peter persisted in getting work he cared about before an audience's East and West, some of whom he knew in the East got it. I want to speak, though, of my own experience with Peter. In fact, if it weren't for Peter, I wouldn't be speaking here, and I likely wouldn't be a specialist or an art historian of the American West. 45 years ago, during the summer that I moved to Texas for my first teaching job at Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, I regularly hung out in the library. It's a spectacular, wonderful library, the Amon Carter Museum of Western Art. And I had an introduction to the director, Mitch Wilder, who made sure I met the terrific staff. Among them was Peter. I imagined Peter would be my guide through Western American art, quite new to me, and to the Carter's impressive collection, as I was a teacher down the street. But I was wrong. You might picture my disappointment when I learned that Peter had accepted the directorship here at Cody. Yet, with his departure, the Carter's director recruited me to take Peter's place. I'm sure, though, that no one thought I was taking Peter's place. His boots were too big to fill. But there I was, as curator at the Carter, learning from Peter after all, through his scholarly and curatorial legacy at the museum where I cut my teeth. Peter's generosity extended to inviting me to speak at the Buffalo Bill, and later as a teacher in the Summer Institute, and then as a member of the Whitney's Advisory Committee, associations all very meaningful to me. We were on the same panels at conferences, and our work appeared side by side in such publications as The American West in Bronze, that exhibition at the Met that some New Yorkers didn't get. It was always a pleasure to work with Peter, and I always learned a lot and felt challenged along the way. To back up a bit about Peter, he came of age as an art historian at a critical moment in the study of Western American art. In 1967, 2 years before Peter arrived, the Carter's director, Mitchell Wilder, declared in a press release, quote, "We have found it difficult to separate Western art and American art." Therefore, Mitch continued, the museum's work no longer will be limited to Western art. And I can't resist showing you this talented trio, Ron Tyler, Mitch Wilder, and of course, Peter Hassrick, who guided the museum in these crucial years. Ron and Peter both arrived in 1969, 2 years after Mitch's proclamation. It was a bold statement that Mitch made in 1967, about which Peter and I later spoke, and agreed we weren't quite sure we understood what Mitch meant by Westering America, a term that he borrowed from Bernard DeVoto. But we also agreed it took the Carter Museum and so the field in new directions, directions I'll follow with you today. The Carter's changing names reflected Mitch's and later directors' visions, from its founding as the Amon Carter Museum of Western Art in 1961 to the Amon Carter Museum in 1977, and then, as you can see here now, changing the name on the exterior wall since 2010, the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. Peter's leadership developed, I think, from his years at the Carter. Accessible, deep scholarship was key there and at the Buffalo Bill, across collections and publications. Installations, reinstallations, and special exhibitions probed new ideas. Plus, he reinstalled or expanded all the museums here in Cody and established a new one. Of course, I don't have to tell you that. I was sorry that Peter left Cody, but admired his decision to become the founding director of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe. And I respected his departure from the O'Keeffe when he felt he had done what he came to do there, to get the museum open. Thereafter, while he chose administrative and academic posts as director of the Russell Center and the Charles M. Russell Memorial Chair at the University of Oklahoma, and founding director at the Institute of Western Art, later the Petrie Institute at the Denver Art Museum, he devoted himself almost full-time to scholarship, organizing exhibition after exhibition and serving as lead author on many catalogs, even after his retirement, a word that I have to put in quotes for Peter, right up until the time of his untimely death. His wide-reaching legacy will live on in the institutions in which he worked, in his scholarship, and in the scholarship he fostered. With an eye to that fostering, I turn to my own scholarship for some thoughts on where Western American art history has been and where it's headed. And so in fond memory of Peter and in his honor, I'll include the story of a new discovery. It all started at the Amon Carter Museum in 1980, when a few years after I succeeded Peter, we had the opportunity to acquire a painting by the little-known artist Charles Deas. Considering the purchase of Indian group, I found fewer than 20 works by Deas, whose decade-long career ended in 1848, when not yet 30 years old, he was committed to the Bloomingdale Asylum for the Insane. Even before Deas died there, 20 years later, his art had effectively disappeared. I know this because two scholars who looked for his paintings between 1860 and 1874 found none. When in 1947, John Bauer, then curator at the Brooklyn Museum, sought works by Deas, he uncovered 4. By 2010, I could locate 50 of his paintings and drawings, 30 of which I included in a monographic exhibition I organized for the Denver Art Museum. I also had records of perhaps 50 additional works and was confident many of them, of these so-called lost Deases, would surface after the exhibition. I was wrong. Only 2 have appeared since 2010. One of these 2 paintings, called The Wounded Pawnee, will be the focus of the story I'll tell you a bit later. But first, to back up and tell you a little bit more briefly about Deas. He started his career in New York City during the depressed economy begun by the Panic of 1837. And here you see the artist's self-portrait at the age of 21 and a lithograph that shows the area of Lower Manhattan where he lived and worked. The themes of his paintings responded to these trying times. Fair play in turkey shooting, taken from a James Fenimore Cooper story, now at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Foreclosure in The Devil and Tom Walker, now in the Richard Williams collection, a painting that drew from a Washington Irving story. And Rigged Barroom Bets in Walking the Chalk, now at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, a painting we'll look at more closely a bit later. Between 1838 and 1840, Deas exhibited a dozen literary and genre scenes like these in New York City. But struggling to make a living in these economic conditions, as were many artists at the time, he left New York in 1840 to travel in the West, where he found new subjects among the Native American tribes he visited in the upper Midwest. By late 1841, he decided not to return to New York and to settle in St. Louis, where he made his home and his living for the next 6 years until his mental illness forced him back to his family in New York City. He supported himself with portrait commissions from prominent white citizens in St. Louis, and in one case of a prominent white citizen's prized dog, oddly named Lion, whose full-scale portrait is one of the artist's best. I want you to notice here, though, for what we're going to be looking at later, Deas's distinctive compositional choice. A single large element, in this case the dog, is close to the picture plane. It almost fills the foreground. And then the artist abruptly jumps the action into deep background set against a landscape topped with expressive clouds. Deas's compositional tendency of omitting a middle ground will be important when we re-examine the Wounded Pawnee. The Western landscapes and American Indian subjects he exhibited at local cultural venues replaced the literary and narrative genre scenes he had shown in New York in the late 1830s. But as I'll argue, he carried the themes he established in New York in his early art, competition and conflict, into the West. Here are some examples. Deas inscribed "From Nature" on the verso of Winnebago's Playing Checkers, now in a private collection, which suggests he had firsthand knowledge of the game, attire, jewelry, and attendant objects of the players and the one kibitzer inside the private space of this Ho-Chunk Bark Lodge. Charles Landman, following a visit to Deas' St. Louis studio in 1846, reported what he likely learned from the artist, that he, quote, annually spends a few months among the Indian tribes, familiarizing himself with their manners and customs, close quote. Clearly, he sought out new experiences and wanted to know more about the lives of Native Americans. Deas' interest in American Indian peoples likely prompted him to accompany an army expedition into the territories, which inspired the painting that is my new discovery, The Wounded Pawnee. Today, I'll tell you the story of the reappearance of this painting, which was last seen publicly in 1848. 168 years later, on January 15th, 2016, in the beautiful Louis Kahn designed Kimball Art Museum, I met a man who thought this painting, which he had inherited, was by Charles Deas. And so, with Northern Light filtering into the conservation laboratory, the Kimball's chief conservator, Claire Barry, led the painting's owner and me to evaluate the condition and execution of the possible Deas. We placed the picture side by side with Indian Group, which the Amon Carter's curator, Rebecca Lawton, had kindly agreed to have at the lab. And you'll remember that early in my career, I had shepherded Indian Group into the Carter's collection. So this was somewhat of a homecoming for me, a kind of reunion, and it was exciting indeed to put these two paintings side by side. We found them, each signed and dated 1845, to be consistent in facture and in style, convincingly by the same hand. The new picture revealed Deas' struggle with anatomy throughout his brief career. You can see that his left arm disappears without adequate space behind the white shield, as well as his deft integration of figure and landscape. It also has his characteristic abrupt jump from foreground to background action, as we saw in his portrait of the dog named Lion, and here in Indian Group. Examination of the portrait under ultraviolet light illuminated a section at the lower right that appeared to have been heavily overpainted, probably to cover old damage. You see here an image taken in raking light, and you can notice this area right here of overpaint, crazed varnish, and that discolored varnish, and heavily overpainted. This image was taken under raking light, but it shows you that area of damage. And corresponding to this area was a patch on the back of the canvas, and the water damage that we likely see here may have been the source of this old damage that we had noted on the front of the painting. But the canvas otherwise was sound. You can see here in what we think is its original stretcher, and it had not been relined. The Edward Duchot stamp that you see here on the canvas verso provided circumstantial evidence of the painting's maker. Although Duchot canvases were common in the 1840s, this stamp appears on at least 3, and I suspect more, of Deas' paintings. It was a canvas that he favored. But most importantly, examination under these various conditions and under the stereo microscope revealed that a well-painted, intriguing, if violent, of course, subject lay beneath layers of surface dirt and yellowed varnish, which the owner subsequently removed in a successful conservation of the picture as you see it here today. I'll return to the Wounded Pawnee in a few minutes, but now I want to make an argument for seeing Deas' brief career, to which I've introduced you by a few paintings he made in New York and the paintings that he made in St. Louis. To think about his career as a whole, rather than divided between East and West, as is almost always the case for so-called Western artists. Think Albert Bierstadt in the Rockies, upper left, of course, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 1863, or in the Swiss Alps at Lake Lucerne, National Gallery of Art, 1858. There's no reason to separate Bierstadt's attitudes toward mountains and their meanings, even as we probe the different circumstances and inspirations for these two paintings. Each expresses his ideas about the role mountains played in the relationship between man and nature in the mid-years of the 19th century. And consider Frederick Edwin Church's gorgeous 1860 Twilight in the Wilderness, now at the Cleveland Museum. We can read this scene set in Western Maine historically, not only the fiery coming of civil war, but also a hopeful look west to the setting sun and the possibility of a new chapter in the American story. Although Church never set foot in the West, we cannot talk about this picture without understanding the role the West played in Church's time, and so in his art. And we can't talk about Bierstadt's Rocky Mountains without understanding Bierstadt's Eastern perspective, even his German birth and training. Western Maine and Western Wyoming inspired these artists to statements about America. They shouldn't be separated into camps of East and West. I return your attention to Peter's commitment to understanding the relationship of any Western painting to other works of the period, such as Remington as an Impressionist artist. Here's a Remington winter scene we see more effectively in the context of other American winter scenes, such as John Twachtman. And of course, we understand Twachtman's winter scenes. He's very well known as a painter of winter, better in the context of Remington's scenes. I'm sure that you recognize, not only by seeing the Twachtman signature in the lower left of the upper left slide, but you would also recognize the way in which Remington handles shadow, I think particularly here, and his application of paint. But the point is, these two very different artists were looking at quiet scenes away from the bombast, looking at something different in America, East and West. I also return to Mitch Wilder's concept of Westering America, to his wise perception that the West did not, and does not, we would say, exist separately from the East. West and East are inextricably bound in the idea and the reality of America, and we must bind together the art devoted to each region. We have also changed some of our thinking about Western art, and I'll give you a brief overview of how this has played out. At the time, Amon Carter was collecting from 1935 to about 1955. Western paintings were judged, for the most part, on their quality as evidence, what some called their authenticity. As the eminent Smithsonian historian John Ewers summarized it in 1967, quote, "We must try to separate the wheat from the chaff, the fact from the fiction in Western art." Fictional works of art, according to Ewers, weren't useful to historians. But there were equally strong voices on the other side. As early as 1953, Bernard DeVoto, a leading historian of the American West, expanded our vision of the art devoted to this region beyond evidence. The graphic arts, DeVoto wrote, can be made to disclose not only the exterior facts, they can also reveal how persons, classes, and perhaps a whole people responded to exterior facts. Nancy Anderson, my colleague at the National Gallery, chronicled this change in an important 1992 essay on which I rely. But I found a fabulous example of this change in thinking about Western art in the first publication of an important Deas painting called Voyagers, when it entered the collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 1949. This moment, 1949, marked more than a change in interpretation of Deas's paintings. It offered a new path to understand Western American art, a path that not too many people took in 1949, but eventually it happened. But let me go back and sort of show to you how people responded to this painting and why that matters. In 1847, the St. Louis Reveille critic admired the painting's, quote, weather-worn voyagers who are painted true to life in a scene that is wild and picturesque as nature itself in the solitary regions of the West, close quote. A century later, the 1949 MFA Boston catalog entry on this painting quoted a similar passage from 1847 about voyagers and their lives. Critics a century apart then thought this painting was an open window onto the Western world Deas inhabited, that it illustrated, in effect, Western life, and so, in John Ewers' terms, would be authentic. But John Bauer, in an essay in the same 1949 MFA Boston catalog, responded quite differently and quite extensively to Voyagers. His fresh understanding ignored the prevailing ethnographic interpretations presented in the catalog entry. Instead, Bauer judged Voyagers to be about, quote, the inner life and nature of mankind, close quote. Bauer deploys such adjectives as mysterious, ominous, and grotesque to describe the landscape elements Deas, quote, wove together with the human actors to create a mood of isolation and peril. Bauer goes beyond the specific history of Voyagers to look anew at the painting. Biography guided his interpretation of Deas' art, even without specifying what he knew, that the artist later suffered from mental illness and was committed to an asylum. Although Bauer could not have known in 1949 what I know now, that Deas showed symptoms before he painted Voyagers. Bauer was the first to look beyond the ethnographic in Deas' paintings toward what he recognized as the psychological implications of the artist's integration of man and nature in dangerous settings. He saw that danger, even violence, lay at the heart of Deas' art. He didn't limit interpretation of this artist's painting to the established ethnographic reading. Instead, he considered this work as he and other art historians considered mainstream, then mainstream American art, i.e. art made about the Eastern United States. I want to bridge the East-West divide by springing from Voyagers to make a brief case for the thematic consistency of Deas' art with three little-known paintings, each of which returned to public view over the past 25 years. More generally, I want to challenge conventional thinking about Western American art to bring fresh context and new understanding, I hope, to works we all care about. The first is the Deas now in the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, Walking the Chalk, to which, as I promised, we would return. The picture resurfaced in Nova Scotia in 2007, having last appeared publicly in 1839, the year it was painted, a year after it was painted. Its ostensible subject is a barroom wager on a drunken man's ability to walk a straight line. Deas' initial audience in New York saw the painting as a humorous treatment of a subject that critics considered somewhat crude, and thought that the artist had not adequately moralized, a term that comes up frequently in criticism of genre paintings like this. But they missed his point. Look again. The well-dressed young man seated at right here with the straw-colored hair, tipping his the little bench he sits on being held back from falling forward by this man here and spilling his drink as he stares in dismay at the chalked line, realizing he will lose whatever he's wagered on the bar to the barflies whose winks and thumb noses alert us at the left that this young man is a mark for a rigged bet. The chalk walker only appears to be drunk and disheveled. He successfully, even theatrically, navigates the line. And so Deas' story is a moral warning. Upstanding young men should not go to bars and be lured into rigged bets. But there's more. Notice that apart from all the others, an older black man is seated on a stool and silhouetted against a bright red curtain in the background window. That calls attention to him, of course. He leans forward and plants his bare foot on the white chalk line. Deas constructs this man as an outsider. And we might conclude today that his action alludes to the color line he cannot cross, taking a moral stand on America's rigged competitive and racial structures. Early viewers did not see, perhaps could not see, this very American moral story or moral stories. Or if they did, they chose not to write about them. Remember that we are interpreters of today, so we can see a picture differently. We have to see a picture differently. There's no other way, such as the way that I described it, the way I can see it today, differently from how those who saw it in 1838 responded, and differently from how those a century from now will see it as well. The second painting to which I draw your attention is Wakanchaheraga, which hid in plain sight on the walls of the St. Louis Mercantile Library until 1996, when the organization's librarian, John Hoover, questioned its attribution to George Catlin. The painting, unsigned, undated, and undocumented, came into the library's collection in 1869, along with 3 related portraits. Technical comparison with a painting known to be by Deas and a signed oil sketch of an identified Ho-Chunk leader that surfaced in 1990 led not only to a firm attribution of the 4 mercantile portraits, but also identified the sitter in this one, the large portrait, as Wakanchaheraga. It's important to see how Deas extended portraiture into narrative in his change from the small, and this is much larger in comparison than it is in actuality. You see it larger here, the small oil on paper sketch into a narrative in the large oil painting on your right, of course, by animating his protagonist and including 2 collaborators. Deas animates the man by making him appear to be rising inside a bark lodge, to focus his gaze at something beyond our vision. Notice that the piece metal around his neck swings beneath his blanket as he rises to his feet. And notice too that in each lower corner, an eerie face peers out, there and more visible here, giving the picture a greater aura of intrigue, even of conspiracy. Deas leaves unresolved the source of the man's alarm or the role of the 2 men in shadow, but conflict is brewing. The identity of this man, whom Deas likely met about 1841, and the obscured piece metal he wears around his neck suggest the conflict was with whites. Wakanchaheraga, whom whites called Rolling Thunder, was a famed Ho-Chunk leader who had led opposition to the federal government's efforts in 1837 to move his people farther west. Deas's portrait presents collaborative and determined, if precarious, native power in a relentlessly, often violently expanding white nation. If conflict is implicit in walking the chalk and impending in Wakantuheraga, it breaks wide open in The Wounded Pawnee, which we left in the Kimball Art Museum's conservation lab. Let's return to it now. The owner of this painting knew only that from the mid-1950s, it hung in the dining room of his grandparents' home in New Rochelle, New York. After seeing it at the Kimball, I matched it with a days called The Wounded Pawnee, the paper trail of which I lost track of when the American Art Union in New York City distributed it to one of its members in 1848. Deas's late 1840s New York audience mostly ignored the picture, and only his biographer, Henry Tuckerman, described it in 1846 as, quote, a Pawnee galloping on an unshorn and unharnessed horse across the prairie. Yes, it is that. But Tuckerman's words inadequately describe the scene we see, especially the violence at its core. I suspect that such violence disrupted Tuckerman's idyllic fantasy of the West, which he expressed very clearly in other passages. And so he didn't or couldn't write about it here. What we see in any work of art depends on who we are and when we look. And so I offer a different description, informed by my own time and place as a New York City-born septuagenarian woman of European descent who grew up in the reign, we might say, the shadow of the Lone Ranger and Tonto. Now living and working gratefully on the ancestral land of the indigenous Massachusetts people, I seek to understand the complex interactions between Euro-American artists and their American Indian subjects in the mid-19th century. So after prodding and probing the Wounded Pawnee at the lab, my response to the subject was emotional, focused on the pain of the wounded horse and rider silhouetted against gray clouds that seemed piled up just to focus our attention on him. And notice, of course, how the horse is leaping across the stream away from some enemy into this beautifully painted deep prairie grass. It's an interesting combination, of course, of beautifully painted landscape and clouds and a violent subject. Then I concentrated on a central object, the buffalo hide covered shield from which a hank of human hair sprouts at its red center. And you'll notice in the painting that red carries your eye throughout. From here, my eye followed some of that red toward the white feathered headdress that frames the terror and resolve I read in the warrior's face. I noticed how his body twisted to look back at an enemy, exposes wounds in his forehead, chest, and shoulder, from which blood streams. And there's even blood in his eye. His horse, too, is suffering. Blood is in its eye, snorted from its nostrils and coursing down its side. And finally, the white paint highlighting the feathered fletching on one of the arrows embedded in the horse's hindquarters pointed me to the bloodied hourglass brand, which you see here. This prompted me to wonder whether Deas and his audience might have made of this, of the brand, of course, of the whole picture. Could they have seen the hourglass's time running out for this Pawnee and by extension for other American Indians? But did all early viewers see a doomed people? Wouldn't viewers in St. Louis have responded differently from those in New York City? And what might a Pawnee have seen in 1845, or a missionary working with them then? And how might we all now look freshly at this painting? The art historian James Elkins argues that seeing bound by time and place is, quote, irrational, inconsistent, and undependable. I should not expect Tuckerman to have seen the same picture I did. But what do I make of my experience of looking? I guess Elkins would ask you, how dependable am I as an interpreter, both of the painting in its historical context and of the painting today? My research on this large exhibition painting, it mattered to Deas. He submitted it to the art union. It is one of his larger paintings. But my research revealed that its subject is intertribal warfare, likely based on stories Deas heard of the June 1843 Lakota raid on one of the Pawnee villages near the Loup River in present-day Nebraska. This happened just a year before Deas visited the villages with Major Clifton Wharton's Army expedition to the Pawnee. It's important to remember that this battle took place and that we're looking at contested land. Pawnees and Lakotas hunted there, and the United States claimed it as territory purchased from France. The suffering of man and horse that we witness gives the painting its emotional punch. Deas's initial audience, who, as I mentioned, had little to say about the painting, did likely see the warrior as a generic Indian, destined to disappear under the pressure of white movement across the continent. But we can read the story differently, as one of resistance emerging from such a stereotype, by recognizing resolve as well as terror in the warrior's eyes, and knowing that the Pawnee people survived battles with other tribes like this, and removal from their villages along the Upper Platte and Loup Rivers, eventually to Oklahoma, home today to some 3,200 tribal enrolled members who live there and across the United States. A painting's meaning is never fixed. We are always there to reinterpret it. A Black man enlightens walking the chalk. Deas's moralizing story of trickery and greed involving one Black man at least, and whites, young and old. Wakanchaheraga and the Wounded Pawnee address brewing Native conflict with whites, or intertribal warfare played out under the pressure of white settlers. Racial competition and conflict over resources, land, and power are at the heart of them all. They are American pictures. One last word. For the observations and the conclusions that I've drawn with you today, I'm dependent on the example set by Mitch Wilder, my first boss, and consultation with other scholars, including Emma Hansen, Ann Helmreich, Marnie Sandweiss, and Bill Trutner. I acknowledge them all and only wish Peter were here with us today to argue with me. And I thank you, my patient audience.
Well, that was incredible. And I'm going to bring up Carol. I think we all have a sense of how lucky Carol's students have been over the years. And we today, her audience, let's see if I can pull this up, are just as lucky as well. I'd like to make a couple remarks, but I want to make sure that Carol is with us to do so. Carol, can you hear me?
I can.
Great, and we can hear you. That's wonderful.
Okay.
Carol, thank you so much for helping us celebrate Peter's legacy today and for really modeling the kind of nuanced and rich art historical inquiry that's informed by close connoisseurial looking and as well an expansive understanding of context and acknowledgement of one's place in history. This is the kind of art history that Peter engaged with and that I look to you and to Peter and others as a model for my own work. I'm just so thankful for you sharing your incredible expertise with us today, helping us see differently and again recognize our place in history, and calling us to look really closely at these paintings with which we thought we might be familiar. So I'd love to take an opportunity to have a couple questions from the audience, and how I think this will work best is if you ask it, I will repeat it to Carol, and we can have your questions, your burning questions answered. Yes, Bev Perkins.
Hi, that was fabulous, and so interesting. So I do have two questions. One's going to be simple. They're both simple. So how large are these paintings?
Okay.
And my other question is, where is Lyon's portrait now?
Gotcha. Carol, you've got a question from our Chief Conservator, Bev Perkins. And firstly, she said, wow, what an incredible presentation. And she has two questions, the first of which are, how large are Deas's paintings generally? I know there's a range, so maybe you can tell us generally what their sizes are. And also, where is Lion? Oh, oops, where's Lyon's portrait these days? So you started, yeah, sorry, you jumped in. Okay, Carol.
Thank you, Karen, for those kind words, and how wonderful to get a first question from my dear friend Bev. So Deas's paintings, some of them, like the Amon Carter's pictures, are quite small, in the 20s inches, and others 36 perhaps. Lion is one of the largest of his canvases, as well as the lacrosse picture at the Gilcrease. So he varies his genre pictures, his early genre pictures, and some of the earliest St. Louis pictures tend to be small-ish, I would say. And then perhaps a commission for Lion. Maybe the dog was just so big in order to fit him on a canvas. But Wounded Pawnee is one of his largest. And I should have mentioned too that by the time the Wounded Pawnee was distributed at the Art Union in 1848, Deas had been institutionalized, and that was noted in the newspapers. And so perhaps some of the silence on this work was owing to the fact that people didn't quite know what to say about an artist who had gone mad, in effect. So anyway, thanks, Bev. That I should have mentioned the exact size, rather than saying larger, smaller, but this is a big one, a relatively big one, 32 by 36.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Bev. Do we have other questions for Carol?
Sorry, where is Lion?
Oh, yes. Carol, where is Lyon's portrait today? Will you remind us?
The Lyon's portrait is actually, it was still being exhibited in St. Paul at the original home where it was intended to be. Now part of a historic park. It's closed in the winter, and not Fort Snelling, nearby, near Fort Snelling. And it may be in the winter housed, and maybe it's moved in the last couple of years to the Minnesota Historical Society that oversees it. But it's unusual, it's a really interesting question. It's unusual to have a painting be in its original context. And Lion, for a long time, could be seen in a stone house near the Mississippi River.
Great. Yes, Tim White.
Carol's emerging definition of American art, revised definition of American art, seems to depend as much or more on the experience of the artist than the experience of the subject. Could you talk about that interplay a little bit?
Yes, Carol, a question from Tim is about the position of the artist and the position of the subject in defining Western American art.
Western American art, largely
Now largely American art. Can you talk a little bit about balancing those perspectives and trying to incorporate them both in the work that you do?
The artist's perspective is essential. It is what happens as the work is being made. The cultural, the personal, emotional artistic experience brought to the making of art, that moment of making. I would argue that the minute the artist has a say, and few artists today will say my painting means, and I'm not sure that many artists in the past would actually come out and say that. But at the moment it leaves the artist, one could say it's open for interpretation. And in that way, those who see it might see it very differently from the artist's so-called intentions. We try to gather those. I think all of us would try to understand what was the artist thinking, what was the artist doing when they made this painting? And then we say, all right, what do we see? What do we bring to that? It's a kind of conversation, I think, maybe three-way between an inanimate object, unless it's a moving sculpture, and the artist who made it, and the viewer who encounters and interprets it.
Thank you. While people might be formulating other questions, Carol, I wonder if you could talk about how this kind of seeing, which has changed through the years, how this type of Western American art history and its definition that has modulated, how does this play out in museums of Western American art? You might speak specifically to the Buffalo Bill Center of the West. What are you seeing today?
That's a really good question, Carol. Any museum is limited in a way by the acquisitions that have come to it over time and by its charter. I see that as limited not in a negative way, but in a and plus kind of thing, that we could see Remington, for example, of which you have such great works, as an artist devoted to the West, who came from the East, whose works were seen in the East. That can be done on labels, and you also have many paintings that were done outside of the West. So that kind of context, that's one way I think the museum can really effectively indicate to its visitors what these paintings or sculptures meant at their time and what they can mean to us today. The other is, I love focus shows, or whatever they call spotlight shows, that you take one work of art and you borrow a couple few around it in order to show different kinds of contexts, whether other paintings by the same artist or by different artists at the time. I think those are interesting opportunities for interpretation and highlighting particular works in a collection. Now, artists like Charlie Russell, who, as far as I know, didn't paint anything but Western art was his subject, and John Singleton Copley didn't paint till he went to England anything but images of Bostonians, for the most part, and those who lived in Maine. In that case, I think you really have to do more contextual work with film or video or labels, rather than, you don't want to argue that he painted other things, of course, because he didn't. But I think that for each institution and each artist, there might be different opportunities.
Absolutely. And I think I'll ask Tim White to just come up and restate his question himself, because I'm afraid I misinterpreted it. Tim, do you mind just talking to Carol here to make sure we get to the meat of your question?
No, I'm put on the spot and don't feel even qualified to ask the question, but I'll try. Carol, think of the Wounded Pawnee and many things here at the Whitney. People who experience the art often don't know much about the artist, and the experience is with the subject as rendered, not with the artist, where scholars and historians tend to look at the dynamics of the artist. Those who are experiencing the art see the dynamics of the subject. And my question had to do with the interplay between those two things. Are they totally different? Are they related? Is the viewer absolutely dependent upon the view of the artist?
Thanks, Amy. Perfectly. It's a great question, very well expressed. I don't think that a viewer should be limited by the interpretation of the artist. By that I mean what the artist said that they thought at the time, or what they think their art means, which is hard to get at oftentimes. Artists don't say it often. But even if an artist did, that's one perspective. It's an important perspective, no doubt. But then you raise really a question that always, I think, is most important when someone encounters a work. What you see is in front of you, not the history of the artist or what the artist, other works done at the time. You see a subject, you see a man, it's a Pawnee from the label, wounded, on horseback. What's going on? You want to know about what you see. And I think the best labels lead a viewer to greater understanding of what it is that viewer sees. You don't really want to know he trained at the National Academy of Design, he moved here or there. Maybe you don't even care where he was born. But what you want to know is what's happened to that Pawnee? How did he get there? What was the context for the subject? And that might be the best label. I would love to write a label for this painting. That might be the best label, and you sort of led me to think, to remind me, to think about that. Our viewers need to be guided back to the painting, not to something else. And it's hard to write labels that do all that we want for our viewers to take away. So thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Carol, thank you so much for encouraging us to look closely and for challenging we art historians in the group, those with a wonderful opportunity to work at museums and involved in education, to really write the most compelling label, to really bring everybody into the conversation, so in new and nuanced ways. With that, Carol, I will invite this crowd to continue to convene for 15 minutes or so with coffee with treats. And just to get together and have a chance to chat with Peter, or about Peter. And before we dismiss, I want to recognize Buzzy Hassrick is here with us, and we thank you so much for your presence. And Buzzy has a question, actually, so we can't miss that. Yes, Buzz.
Questions, actually.
Okay.
Carol, where's the lobster?
Carol, where's the lobster?
It's right here, but it's on its way to be delivered by Pony Express.
Critical.
My other questions are, what's over her right shoulder on the wall?
Yes, Carol, tell us a little bit about the Brock-esque work over your right shoulder on the wall.
I do not know who made that. It could be an artist from Baltimore called Keith Martin, who made a number of woodcuts and collages here. And it also could be my late husband, Charles Parkhurst's work. It is not recorded in his list of works. Many of the Keith Martins are among his. I can tell you who did these two, my friend Charlie Conwisher. They're really hard to see at this distance, but they are stipple works on pencil, on paper. But I don't know who did that. I wish I did. I asked anyone who knows. It sort of looks marine-like to me, but I have no idea. And I've tried Google reverse search and asked people, but maybe someone will figure it out.
It's wonderfully
Great question.
musical, it seems.
Yeah, maybe musical. Yeah, that's a good. I like it. I like its mystery too.
And Buzzy, your last question?
Is, it sounds like for half a century you've been interested in Deas, and so I'm just wondering, softball question, what has maintained your interest in this man who did so few pieces and whose life is mostly a mystery?
Mm-hmm. Carol, for half a century you've been interested in Charles Deas. What has maintained your interest with relatively little work information out there? Is that part of the intrigue? What has kept you attached to the subject and seeking more?
Maybe it's always the hope of one more painting, and it keeps you. The artist keeps me going when one pops up, and that. But I have to say, it may seem that the only thing I've ever done is Charles Deas, but it kind of waxes and wanes in my life. The first opportunity was at the Amon Carter in 1980, when a dealer, James Maroney, brought this painting to us. It had been in St. Louis in a private collection, and I was bowled over. I thought, this is a fantastic work of art. What might we do with this, and might we make a show someday? Well, there weren't enough paintings, and it took a long time for there to be enough. So I just kept files in the old days, stick a piece of paper in a file until I had enough to work on it. And I think he's an artist who wrote a few letters, nothing about himself personally. So he's someone I could not get to know through his writings or the memories of others. There are very few. And so it's the work that spoke to me.
Thank you so much.
And then when I got a call from Nova Scotia, I thought, how did a Charles Deas painting end up in Nova Scotia? They had no idea. They inherited it, like many of these things. And then we saw it had a signature, and we went on the internet and found you. So those are happy moments, and I hope they will continue.
I hope so too.
Thanks, Buzzy. And I hope you like those early photographs of Peter.
Yes, we all did. They were great. And I do have one more hand, and then I'll release us.
How was Deas received by his fellow artists? Was he acknowledged? Did they know his work?
Do we know how Deas was received by his peers, Carol? Was he acknowledged?
He was acknowledged, and he was often seen, he was young when he came on the scene in New York. He came from a family that had slid down the economic ladder. His father may have been a reprobate of some kind, but he came from very fancy South Carolina and New York stock. And he wanted to go to West Point and was denied. For what reasons, it's hard to know. But he's often, I have almost no memories of him except a memorial moment at the National Academy of Design when people say he was a lovely young man. I mean, before he was 30 years old, he was gone from society. He lived on for another almost another 20 years in asylum. But they refer to him as a promising young artist for the most part. And then when he shows his Western works in New York, he chooses to show them in New York. He knew that was where he would get traction, he hoped, for his career. They are generally well received, and in fact, the managers of the American Art Union buy his works. They are, prominent collectors of their time. And he was one of the leaders of Western subjects coming to the fore at this critical moment in the mid-1840s in New York City. So, admired, but perhaps not understood.
That's a great question. With that, you all, I hope you will join me in a round of applause that Carol will surely hear from afar. Thank you. Thank you so much. What a pleasure, Carol, it was to have you. Afternoon for you, morning for us. Thanks for spending this lovely morning together in communion around Peter and around really stellar Western American art history and American art history. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bravo.